Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Virginia's history. I'd like you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and when you heard this story before we start. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. The smell of magnolia was thick in the air when Josephine Hargrove got to Oakwood Plantation in the summer of 1886. The Civil War had been over for 20 years, but its shadow still hung over the Virginia countryside like the moss that hung from old oaks. The plantation had survived, but it was no longer the grand business it used to be. It was still a symbol of the old Southern aristocracy. Hammond Caldwell was 45 years old when he looked for a wife to help his family name regain some of its former glory. Unlike many of their neighbors, the Caldwells were able to keep their land after the war thanks to a complicated web of financial moves and political ties. Hammond had spent years only thinking about how to keep the plantation productive through the tenant farming system. People in the area were whispering about his lonely life in the big house. Hammond learned about Josephine through a letter-writing arrangement with a matchmaker in Richmond. She was described as a cultured 2-3-year-old woman from a poor but respectable family in Maryland. Her letters were well-written, and the daguerreotype she sent showed a woman with delicate features and thoughtful eyes. After 6 months of writing letters back and forth, Hammond asked Josephine to marry him, and she seemed very happy to say yes. By antebellum standards, the wedding was small, but it was still the biggest social event in the county that year. The local gentry went because they were interested as well as polite. They looked at the bride with the same careful attention that small towns give to new people. She was quiet but polite, and she kept her composure during the ceremony and reception that followed at Oakwood. Many guests were confused by the fact that Josephine didn't have any family members with her. She said that her parents had died and that she didn't have any siblings or close relatives who could come with her. This story was mostly believed. The war and the problems that followed had broken up or killed many families. The newlyweds went to Oakwood Plantation, and the rest of the town moved on to other things. Hammond and Josephine went to church services and social events together for the first year, giving the impression that they were a happy, if quiet, couple. Hammond looked happy with his bride, and Josephine looked like she was getting used to being the mistress of Oakwood. She ran the house well, brought the neglected gardens back to life, and was always polite when people came to visit. People who met Josephine, on the other hand, always felt like something was off about her. She knew about social norms and cultural references that didn't seem to fit with what she said about her background. Sometimes she would say things or show skills that seemed strange for a woman of her age. When asked about these inconsistencies, she would smile and easily switch the subject. Dr. Samuel Holbrook, the county doctor who sometimes saw patients at Oakwood, wrote in his private journal that Josephine acted strangely during his visits. He wrote, "Mrs. Caldwell seems to have an amazing memory for some historical events, but she says she doesn't remember others that anyone her age and background should. When I brought up the great centennial celebration of 1876, she looked at me blankly before quickly recovering and saying she had been sick during that time." Hammond himself started to notice strange things about how his wife acted. He noticed that Josephine never fully undressed for bed in front of him. She always wore a high-neck nightgown and often gloves to bed. She said this was because she was raised to be modest. One of the strangest things about her was that she always locked her bedroom door after Hammond went to sleep. He only found out about this by accident when he woke up one night and couldn't get back in after stepping out. Josephine said that she had been trained to lock herself in as a safety measure because she often sleepwalked as a child. Hammond didn't want to upset the peace of their still new marriage, so he accepted this explanation even though he wasn't sure it was true. Hammond's wife became more and more interesting to him as the seasons changed. But at the same time, she disturbed him. There was something in her eyes that didn't match her age. A depth that made him feel like she was studying him like a specimen instead of loving him as a husband. Still, he pushed these thoughts away, saying they were just part of the normal adjustment period for any marriage. About 15 months after their wedding, in the fall of 1887, Hammond wrote to his cousin in Richmond to share his worries about his wife in a subtle way. He wrote, "Josephine is a very good mistress of the house, but there are times when I feel like I'm living with a stranger. Last week, she talked about things that happened before the war in a strange way. as if she had seen them herself, even though she couldn't have been born yet. When I said something about this, she got upset and went to bed early, saying she had a migraine. They got farther apart. They each had their own bedroom, and Josephine said that Hammond's snoring kept her awake. He said that she didn't seem to age much, and her skin stayed unnaturally smooth, even though the harsh Virginia sun and the hard work of plantation life were hard on it. When he said she looked young, she said it was because of a secret family recipe for face cream, and then changed the subject. Martha Wilkes, who worked as a cook at Oakwood, later gave evidence that was recorded in the County Historical Society's archives. Miss Josephine would spend hours in her private sitting room with the door locked. Sometimes I'd hear her talking, though there was never anyone else in there. At first, I thought she might be praying, but the cadence was wrong. It sounded more like she was having a conversation with herself, but in different voices. One, low and harsh. Nothing like her normal speaking tone. In the spring of 1888, a very bad thunderstorm hit, and lightning struck one of the big oak trees near the main house. The fire that started threatened to spread to the house, and in the chaos of getting everyone out, Hammond went into Josephine's private room for the first time in months. What he found there was very strange, a bunch of personal things that looked like they came from different times. There were old-fashioned clothes, jewelry from the early 1800s, and, most disturbingly, a leather-bound journal that looked like it was written by Josephine, but was dated 1843, long before she could have been born. When Hammond told his wife about what he had found, she became unusually upset and said they were family heirlooms that she loved for sentimental reasons. She insisted that the journal had belonged to her grandmother, and that the way she wrote was very similar to how she wrote. Hammond, who was still in love with his beautiful young wife, even though he had doubts, chose to believe her story. Hammond's health started to get worse in 1890. He started to cough all the time and get more and more tired. Dr. Holbrook diagnosed a lung problem and gave Hammond a number of treatments, but his health kept getting worse. Josephine was a caring caregiver during his illness, giving him his medicines and making sure he was comfortable. However, visitors noticed that she seemed distant, as if she were just doing her job instead of caring for her husband. Lucinda Barrett, the postmistress in the nearby town, wrote to Josephine that she got letters from Baltimore all the time, even though Josephine had said she didn't know anyone there. Lucinda brought up the letters in passing, and Josephine said they were from a former school friend. But the handwriting on the envelopes was different each time, and sometimes there were male names on them. As Hammond got weaker, his dreams got worse. He had vivid nightmares where he saw Josephine standing over his bed, looking at him with cold, calculating eyes. In these dreams, she looked different, older in some way, and her features were harder than he had ever seen them in real life. He called these fever dreams and tried to forget about them, but they still made him feel uneasy. As Hammond's health got worse, Dr. Holbrook started to worry about Josephine as well. He saw that the medicines he left behind seemed to run out faster than Hammond's prescribed dose would explain. When he subtly tested Josephine's medical knowledge, he was surprised by how well she knew terms and treatments that most people at the time wouldn't have known. Dr. Holbrook wrote in his medical journal at the time, "I can't shake the feeling that Mrs. Caldwell knows more than her station and education. Today, when we talked about Mr. Caldwell's treatment, she suggested a different way to prepare laudanum that includes plants I have only recently read about in a medical journal from Edinburgh." When I asked her how she knew this, she said she had heard it from a doctor when she was young. Her explanation makes sense, but I can sense a calculation in her answers that deeply troubles me. Josephine took more and more control of the plantation's business as Hammond's health got worse. She looked over the accounts, talked to the tenants, and made decisions about crop rotations with an unexpected amount of knowledge about farming. When asked about her skills, she would smile and say that she was just following Hammond's orders. Jeremiah Tanner, one of the field hands, later told about a strange thing that happened during this time. He had gone to the main house to talk to Hammond about something, but he only found Josephine. She was sitting at the master's desk, like she belonged there, he remembered. She was looking over some old maps of the property. When she saw me, she started talking about how the southeastern field should be turned back into cotton, saying something about how the soil was perfect for it. Then she talked about a crop rotation system that had been used back in 45, as if she had been there herself. It didn't make sense. She would have been a baby then, if she was even born. In January 1891, when Hammond's health was getting better for a short time, he made a shocking discovery. He found a false bottom in one of Josephine's drawers while he was looking for a document in his study. Inside, there were small vials of unknown powders and liquids, as well as a notebook full of what looked like medical formulas written in a code he couldn't figure out. Hammond turned down the evening medicine Josephine brought him that night. He looked stronger than he had in weeks by morning. Hammond asked to talk to Dr. Holbrook alone when he came by later that day. There is no record of what was said in that conversation, but servants said that Josephine was kept out of the room for more than an hour and paced the hallway outside with unusual agitation. Hammond had a very bad relapse the next night. He was delirious with fever by morning and kept saying, "The woman with many faces and eyes that never age." He died 3 days later, never fully coming back to his senses. Pneumonia, a common complication of his underlying lung condition, was listed as the official cause of death. Most of the county's prominent families went to the funeral. They came to pay their respects to the dead person and to see the widow. Josephine wore the right clothes for mourning and showed the usual signs of grief, but many people commented on how calm she was. There were no tears or fits of hysteria, which was common for widows at the time. After the funeral, Dr. Holbrook asked for permission to do an autopsy, saying that he was interested in how Hammond's lung disease had progressed. Josephine firmly said no, saying that her husband had said he wanted to be buried whole. The doctor didn't talk about it in public, but he wrote in his private journal, "I am increasingly convinced that Hammond Caldwell's death warrants further investigation." The rapid acceleration of symptoms following our private conversation suggests intervention rather than natural progression. Without examination, however, my suspicions remain merely that. Josephine said she would keep running Oakwood Plantation instead of selling it or going back to her family in Maryland just a few days after the funeral. People in the community were surprised by this choice. It was unusual for a woman to run a property like this on her own, but it wasn't unheard of in the South after the war. People were really surprised by how good she was at her job. Under her leadership, Oakwood started to do well in ways that it hadn't since before the war. A stranger came to the county in the summer of 1893 and asked questions about Josephine. He said his name was Theodore Hayes and that he was a private investigator from Philadelphia. He rented a room at the local inn and started asking questions about Mrs. Caldwell in a quiet way, focusing on her life before she came to Virginia. Later, Abigail Montgomery, who worked as a maid at the inn, said that she had heard parts of a conversation between Hayes and a local man. The investigator was showing a picture and asking if it was the same woman as Mrs. Caldwell from Oakwood. I saw it for a second. It looked like one of those pictures of a dead woman laid out for burial. I couldn't see her face, but the dress was nice, like something a rich woman would wear. It seems that Hayes died of a heart attack in his room before he could get very far in his investigation. The local doctor didn't find anything strange, but he did say that the man was relatively young for having this condition. Before the police could properly look at his personal belongings, including any paperwork related to his investigation, they went missing. After this event, people started talking about Josephine. Some people remembered hearing stories about a famous fraudster named Lucille Montrose who married and buried 3 rich men in Maryland and Pennsylvania in the 1,870 seconds before disappearing with their money. Some of the things said about this woman sounded like Josephine, but there was no way to prove it. Josephine didn't seem bothered by the whispers. She kept running Oakwood very well, but she slowly stopped going to social events. Her rare visits to town showed small changes in how she looked. Her hair, which used to be a deep brown, now had gray streaks in it, but her face was still very smooth. Some people thought this was because she was becoming more reclusive, which kept her out of the sun that made so many Southern women look older than they were. Abigail Porter, Hammond Caldwell's elderly aunt, came to see Oakwood in the spring of 1894. She had lived in Europe for a long time and had not gone to the wedding or the funeral. Her screams disrupted the household within hours of her arrival. Servants ran to find Abigail pointing at Josephine, her face twisted in fear. "You haven't changed a bit," Abigail yelled. "You're her, aren't you?" The woman who worked for my sister in Baltimore in the 1,850 seconds and stole her jewelry. I would know those eyes anywhere. They haven't changed in 40 years. Josephine said the accusation was false and blamed it on an old woman's confusion. She calmly told Abigail that she needed to rest after her long trip. By morning, Abigail was inexplicably eager to return to Richmond, refusing to stay another night at Oakwood. She wrote a letter to the family lawyer before she left, but the contents were never made public. What was known was that Abigail Porter died in her hotel room in Richmond less than a week later. The cause was said to be a stroke, which is not unusual for a woman her age, but the timing made people who were already suspicious of Josephine Caldwell wonder. Josephine became even more reclusive after Abigail's visit. She let go of several longtime servants and hired people from outside the county who didn't know any local gossip. Dr. Holbrook was the only person who came to Oakwood regularly. He continued to provide medical care when needed and, without Josephine knowing, quietly looked into his growing suspicions. Dr. Holbrook wrote in his medical journal from this time, "Mrs. Caldwell asked for a tincture for pain today, saying she had severe headaches. When I asked her what kind of pain she was feeling, she gave me symptoms that were not typical of a headache. What worried me more was her request for a strong sedative, which I refused to give her in the amount she wanted. There is something about her that bothers me more and more, a hunger in her eyes that I can't put into words." In the fall of 1894, Dr. Holbrook went to Baltimore, where he said he was going to a medical conference. Later letters show that his real goal was to look into Josephine's claimed origins. He found something that made him uneasy. There was no record of a Josephine Hargrove who looked like her in the town she said she was born in. Also, when he showed her daguerreotype to people who had lived there for a long time, one old woman became very upset. The woman kept saying, "That's Victoria Winters. She was married to my cousin's neighbor in 1962, but she vanished after he died in strange circumstances. People said she went back to her family up north, but there were rumors that she had been seen with other men before her husband was buried." Dr. Holbrook's investigation took him to Philadelphia, where he got in touch with colleagues at a number of medical facilities. After a lot of effort, his questions led him to Bowman Asylum, where the superintendent finally agreed to share a disturbing case history. Agatha Blackwood was sent to the asylum in 1865 after her husband died in a strange way. People said she was very smart, manipulative, and thought she could move her mind from one body to another. A physiological anomaly made her case stand out. Even though she was in her 42nd when she was committed, she didn't show many signs of aging during her 20 years in the hospital. Dr. Marcus Pierce, who was in charge of her case, wrote in his notes, "The patient shows an unnatural retention of youth that cannot be explained by medicine. Her chronological age advances, but her physical appearance stays mostly the same. She says this is because of what she calls the transfer, a process by which she claims to keep living by taking the life essence of others." The record of Agatha's escape in 1885 was even more disturbing. It seems that she had become close to a young nurse at the asylum named Eleanor Hargrove. That night, both women went missing. 3 days later, Eleanor's body was found in a boarding house, but the cause of death was not known. No one ever found Agatha Blackwood. The asylum record's description of Agatha looked a lot like Josephine Caldwell, but the age didn't match up with how young she looked. However, the fact that the last name Hargrove was the same could not be ignored. The winter of 1895 was especially bad. For weeks at a time, heavy snow made it impossible for people in Oakwood to get to the nearby town. In February, when the roads were finally clear, Dr. Holbrook was called to the plantation to take care of Josephine, who was said to have the flu. What he found made him very upset. Josephine was weak and had a fever, but the doctor was more interested in the strange marks on her wrists and neck. They looked like old scars that had been hidden by her high collars and gloves. Josephine got angry and told him to leave when he tried to look at the marks more closely. Dr. Holbrook wrote in his journal that night, "I am more and more sure that Mrs. Caldwell has a terrible secret. The scars I saw today looked like they were from restraints, maybe from a long stay in an institution. This would explain some of the strange things she does and knows." I am afraid for the safety of the people living at Oakwood, and I have decided to tell the authorities what I have found." Before Dr. Holbrook could carry out his plan, someone he didn't expect came to see him. Josephine came to his office the next night and said she was better and wanted to apologize for being rude when she left. She brought a bottle of good brandy as a peace offering and suggested they drink it together to get their friendship back on track. Mary Sullivan, the doctor's housekeeper, later said that the two spent more than an hour in his study. Josephine looked calm and collected when she left. That night, though, no one saw Dr. Holbrook again. There was no sign of trouble in his office by morning, except for 2 empty brandy glasses. When the doctor didn't show up for his scheduled appointments, a search was set up. His horse and buggy were found near the river, where they had been left behind. This makes it likely that he fell in and drowned. But they never found his body, even after a lot of dragging of the waterway. Josephine was shocked and worried about the doctor's disappearance, and she even offered a reward for information that would help find him. But in private, she did things that showed she knew he would be gone for good. In just a few days, she sold a lot of expensive jewelry and moved a lot of money from Oakwood's accounts to banks in Richmond and Baltimore. In the spring of 1895, Oakwood became more interesting. A stranger came and said he was James Hargrove, Josephine's brother, who had never been mentioned in any of her stories about her family before. He was tall and thin, and he acted like a scholar. He said he had just found his sister after years of being apart, which is why he had suddenly shown up. People who met James Hargrove thought he looked familiar, but they couldn't say why. He moved to Oakwood with very little luggage, and right away got involved in the plantation's business. He, like Josephine, showed knowledge and skills that didn't seem to fit with what he said about his background, especially when it came to medicine and chemistry. The relationship between Josephine and her supposed brother was the strangest of all. Servants said that they often spoke in whispers and sometimes got into heated arguments before going quiet when other people came near. They ate together in private instead of in the dining room, and they weren't often seen together outside of the house. Henrietta Jackson, a housemaid at Oakwood during this time, later said, "The way they looked at each other was strange, not like brother and sister at all, and sometimes when they thought no one was listening, they talked about the strangest things. I heard Mr. Hargrove say, 'The transfer is failing earlier each time. We need a more permanent solution.' Miss Josephine just laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. James Hargrove left as quickly as he came in June 1895, supposedly to do business in New York. Josephine said that he would be gone for a longer time because he was going to Europe to look into possible investments for Oakwood's growing business. Josephine's behavior got more and more strange after he left. She would go into the woods on the plantation for hours at a time, coming back messy and distracted. She started keeping a journal and wrote in it all the time. The household staff was most worried about her growing obsession with the abandoned slave quarters, a group of small buildings that had been left to fall apart since the war ended. Josephine said she wanted to turn these buildings into apartments for tenants, so she had them cleaned and fixed up. But after the repairs were done, she wouldn't let anyone in and kept the keys on her at all times. People saw lights in these buildings late at night, and strange smells, like chemical smells, and even more disturbing, what some people said was the coppery smell of blood came from them from time to time. In July, a young woman named Sarah Winters came to Oakwood to ask about a job as a lady's companion. She was pretty, with a delicate frame and polite behavior that made it seem like she had come from a good family that had fallen on hard times. Josephine hired her right away, as if she couldn't wait to let this stranger into her home, which was becoming more and more lonely. Josephine and Sarah's relationship grew at an unusual rate. They were inseparable within weeks, and Sarah even went with Josephine on her secret trips to the newly renovated quarters. The servants noticed that Sarah seemed to become more and more quiet when Josephine was around. Her face became blank, which was very different from how lively she had been at first. Martha Wilkes, who still works as a cook at Oakwood, later said, "Miss Sarah came to me one evening, shaking like a leaf. She said she'd seen something in the old quarters that scared her to death." Before she could explain, Miss Josephine came and took her away. The next morning, Sarah was calm, but she was different. Like something behind her eyes had gone out. Then, Josephine, Bat. In August 1895, the county sheriff got an anonymous letter that said there were strange things going on at Oakwood Plantation. The letter talked about worries about possible illegal imprisonment and mentioned the strange disappearances of Dr. Holbrook and a few transient workers who had worked at the plantation for a short time before disappearing. Before the sheriff could look into these claims, something more important happened at Oakwood. Sarah Winters was found walking down the road to town, confused and covered in blood. When asked, she said she didn't remember how she got there or whose blood was on her clothes. Doctors who looked at her didn't find any injuries that could explain the blood, but they did notice that she was very weak and had a strange mental state. The sheriff and a few deputies went to Oakwood to ask Josephine about what happened. They thought the plantation was very quiet, with no sign of the housekeepers or field hands. Josephine welcomed them into the parlor, looking calm and elegant as always. However, people who were there noticed that she seemed strangely intense. She was shocked by Sarah's condition and said that the young woman must have been attacked while walking on the plantation grounds. Josephine's behavior changed a little when the sheriff asked if he could search the property, especially the newly remodeled quarters. She started to avoid answering questions, saying that some areas were unsafe because they were still being worked on, and she tried to steer the search away from certain buildings. One deputy, who had split off from the main group, found something disturbing in one of the outbuildings. There was a room with what looked like medical equipment, surgical tools, bottles of chemicals, and, most worryingly, restraints attached to a strong table. There were stains on the floor under this table that looked like blood, and some of them were fresh. Josephine stopped the deputy before he could tell his co-workers. Later, witnesses said they heard a gunshot and then shouts. The sheriff got to the building just as it was catching fire, and the flames spread unnaturally fast. No one ever saw the deputy again, and it is thought that he died in the fire. The fire quickly spread to nearby buildings and then to the main house itself. Even though people tried to put out the fire, Oakwood Plantation was mostly destroyed. After the flames died down, people started looking for survivors and victims. Several bodies were found, but they were burned so badly that they couldn't be recognized. People thought that Josephine and the rest of the staff had died in the fire. The victims' bodies were buried in the Caldwell family plot after a funeral service. The community was sad about the terrible loss, and Oakwood Plantation was sold to pay off debts because there was no clear heir. The new owners decided not to rebuild the main house and only use the land for farming. The county hospital took care of Sarah Winters, the only known survivor of the Oakwood tragedy. Her mental health got better over time, but she never fully remembered what happened before the fire. But what she could remember painted a scary picture. She would talk to me for hours, Sarah told investigators, about living forever, about transferring between vessels. At first, I thought it was just philosophical talk, but then she started showing me her journals, dozens of them, dating back to the early 1800s, all in the same handwriting. She said they were her personal history, that she had lived through multiple lifetimes by moving from one body to another. Sarah said she saw what she called the preparation, which was Josephine making tinctures and powders from plants grown in a private garden behind the quarters. She said her original body was long dead, but her essence lived on. Each transfer gave her decades, but never enough. She wanted to stay forever. Sarah's story about the days right before the fire was the most upsetting. She told me I had been chosen, that my body was compatible. She said it was an honor, that I would provide the vessel for her next journey while my consciousness faded away. When I tried to flee, she restrained me. The last thing I clearly remember is a bitter liquid being poured down my throat as she whispered, "Soon we will be one, Marid." Doctors found puncture marks at the base of Sarah's skull and strange chemical compounds in her blood that couldn't be identified with the science of the time. The official explanation for her story was that it was a result of trauma-induced delusions. The case was closed with the finding that Josephine Caldwell had died in the fire. Reverend Thomas Whitfield's report of a strange meeting in 1896 might have ended the story there, making it just another sad footnote in county history. Reverend Whitfield said that on his way to a clerical conference in Baltimore, he saw a woman who looked a lot like Josephine Caldwell getting on a steamship to Europe. The woman was dressed well, and she was with a man who looked important. When Reverend Whitfield yelled, "Mrs. Caldwell," the woman turned for a moment and their eyes met. Then her friend rushed her away. Most people didn't believe the Reverend's story, thinking it was a case of mistaken identity or maybe a delusion brought on by grief. Josephine Caldwell was dead, and her body was buried in Virginia. But his insistence planted seeds of doubt that would grow in local stories for generations. In 1910, while the old courthouse was being fixed up, workers found a packet of papers behind a loose panel in the records room. There was a sealed letter from Dr. Holbrook to the county sheriff that was dated March 1895, but never delivered. The things in this letter make the Oakwood tragedy seem even worse. Dr. Holbrook wrote, "My inquiries have yielded disturbing information regarding the woman known to us as Josephine Caldwell. I have confirmed that no Josephine Hargrove matching her description ever existed in the Maryland town she claimed as her birthplace. More alarmingly, I have received correspondence from a colleague at Bowman Asylum in Pennsylvania who believes our Mrs. Caldwell may be none other than Agatha Blackwood, a patient who escaped from their facility in 1885. The letter from the doctor went on to describe Agatha Blackwood, a very smart and persuasive woman who had been sent to a mental hospital after allegedly poisoning her husband. According to asylum records, she had a strange condition that her doctors called arrested aging, which made her look much younger than she really was. The last paragraph of Dr. Holbrook's letter was the most upsetting. I think Mrs. Caldwell knows what I think. Yesterday, I found out that someone had searched my office, and my private journal is missing. I fear that by the time you get this letter, I may have joined the growing list of people who have met this woman and had bad luck. If anything happens to me, please look into Oakwood Plantation right away." This letter led to a short new investigation in 1910, but not much could be learned after so many years. The bodies in the graves at Oakwood were dug up, but they didn't give any clear evidence. Fire had destroyed most of the identifying features, and the forensic science of the time was not very advanced. The case was officially closed again, but it kept people guessing. A retired medical examiner from Baltimore wrote about a strange case he had seen in 1,852 inches, 1,912. He talked about the death of a rich merchant named William Winters. People thought his young wife, Victoria, was slowly poisoning him. Before any charges could be filed, Victoria Winters had vanished, taking a large part of her husband's wealth with her. The examiner's report had a daguerreotype of Victoria Winters in it. The picture quality wasn't very good for the early 20th century, but it looked a lot like Josephine Caldwell. The examiner also noted that Victoria Winters had a strange medical condition, a small, crescent-shaped birthmark behind her left ear, which was the same as one that several witnesses said they saw on Josephine. A journalist looking into crimes from the previous century talked to Augustus Reed in 1921. Reed had worked at Bowman Asylum as an attendant while Agatha Blackwood was there. Reed's memories made the mystery even more unsettling. She wasn't like the other patients, Reed remembered. Most of them got worse over time, but she stayed sharp and calculating. She would manipulate staff and other patients, making alliances that she would break when they no longer helped her. She even had a theory about transferring consciousness, not just as a delusion, but as a procedure she had come up with. Reed said that Agatha had done rough tests on small animals that had been smuggled into the asylum. She said she could move her mind from one creature to another, using a mix of chemicals and what she called sympathetic connection. Most doctors thought it was crazy, but Dr. Pierce became obsessed with her case and wrote down everything. After she escaped, all of his records disappeared. The strongest proof that Agatha Blackwood and Josephine Caldwell were connected came in 1932 when the journalist found a diary belonging to Eleanor Hargrove, the nurse who had gone missing from the asylum the same night as Agatha. The diary, which was found among Eleanor's distant relatives' things, had entries about how Agatha was becoming more powerful over her. The last entry, which was written just days before the disappearance, said, "A has convinced me to help her escape. She promises we will travel to Europe together once she accesses her hidden funds. I know I risk my position and reputation, but her arguments are persuasive. her vision of our future together compelling. She says, "We are compatible in ways I cannot fully comprehend, that we will be joined in a manner more profound than mere companionship. Tomorrow night, when Dr. Pierce is away, we will make our attempt." During the digging for a building foundation in Philadelphia in 1942, the body of a woman thought to be Eleanor Hargrove was found. Forensic examination showed that the skull was broken and that a surgical procedure had been done at the base of the skull. There was a small, precise hole drilled into the bone, like the ones that were later found in Sarah Winters's medical records. The Oakwood Plantation case kept coming up in the 20th century, leading to many theories and investigations. Workers found a secret compartment with papers and pictures in it while they were fixing up an old hotel in Paris in 1953. One of them was an English-language diary, from 1897 to 1899. The author only called herself J, but she wrote about Virginia several times, including "the boring years at O's, where I almost lost myself in the performance." A picture of a woman in fashionable European clothes from the late 1892 was found with the diary, which was even more disturbing. People who compared it to the surviving daguerreotype of Josephine Caldwell said that the two were very similar, even though the hair and clothes were different. The most disturbing thing was a journal entry from the 31st of December, 1899. Another century approaches, and with it, another transformation. I have carefully chosen my next vessel, a young Russian aristocrat with access to the Tsar's court. How strange to remember that I once feared death. Now that I have learned how to avoid it, I sometimes long for its simplicity, but the hunger always returns, and with it, the need to continue this existence. Hammond was lucky in his way. He never realized that for 10 years he shared his bed not with a wife, but with something much older, wearing her discarded form. The police evidence storage lost the diary and photo in 1954, and no one knows where they are now. In 1895, a terrible house fire killed Josephine Caldwell, and official history says she was a victim. But people in the county where Oakwood Plantation used to be still tell stories about a beautiful woman with ageless eyes who comes as a stranger, marries into wealth, and leaves behind only ashes. Margaret Allen, an old woman, moved into a nursing home in Boston in 1967. She said she was 122 years old, but her papers showed she was actually 87. The staff noted her unusual mental sharpness and her deep knowledge of historical events, especially those from the 19th century, which she talked about as if she had lived through them. Researchers who were interested in the Oakwood case were drawn to Margaret's collection of personal items, which included jewelry that looked like it belonged to Victoria Winters in the 1852nd and Josephine Caldwell in the 1892nd. When asked about these things, Margaret would smile mysteriously and change the subject. A nurse who took care of Margaret during her last illness told a disturbing story. When the morphine had made her tongue loose in her last days, she would talk about people who had died long ago as if she had known them personally. She talked about a plantation in Virginia, a doctor who had become too suspicious, and many other people she had known over the years. She talked about a transfer process that involved certain pressure points at the base of the skull and a mixture she called the elixir. She described it in such a methodical way that it sounded like she was giving instructions. It seems that Margaret Allen died of natural causes related to her old age in 1968. Researchers looking into long life asked for an autopsy, which found a number of strange things. Her brain didn't show any of the usual signs of aging, and there were signs of surgery at the base of her skull, just like in Eleanor Hargrove and Sarah Winters. The most mysterious thing was a small notebook found among her things after she died. It was written in a code that took cryptographers months to figure out. It had what looked like a step-by-step guide to transferring consciousness, as well as chemical formulas and drawings of the brainstem and other parts of the body. The last page had a list of names and dates that went back to 1788. The last entry said, Margaret Allen, 1968 to 19. But the last numbers were blank. A university research lab got the notebook to look at. The lab had a terrible fire that destroyed all of the samples and research materials before any conclusions could be published. The fire killed the head researcher, and the project was dropped. A woman named Victoria Caldwell bought the land where Oakwood Plantation used to be in 1982. People said she was in her late 30s, had striking features, and acted like she was in charge. She paid for archaeological digs at the plantation ruins, saying she was a distant relative of the original owners and was interested in history. People who lived nearby who met Victoria said that she was very interested in the Josephine Caldwell story and knew a lot about the history of plantations. Several people said she looked like the pictures of Josephine that are still around, and they said it was because of her family's genes. The digs were mostly in the area where the slave quarters had been rebuilt. Official reports only talked about historical artifacts that were expected to be found, but there were rumors about more disturbing finds, like surgical tools, strange glass containers, and a small room with restraints built into the walls. Victoria Caldwell left as suddenly as she had come after 6 months of hard work, leaving the excavation unfinished. The new owner of the property filled in the archaeological sites because they didn't care about the land's history. 100 years after the Oakwood fire, in 1995, a string of strange disappearances happened in the county. Over the course of 2 months, 3 young women went missing. They were all last seen near the old plantation land. Even though a lot of searching was done, nothing was ever found. Several witnesses said they saw a classy, middle-aged woman who had been asking questions about the history of Oakwood during the investigation. She said she was a historian, but she didn't leave any contact information and couldn't be found for questioning after the disappearances started. In 2015, a manuscript was sent to a small historical journal that focuses on Southern Gothic literature. This was the most recent chapter in this troubling story. It was called The Vessel Journals and claimed to be the writings of a single mind that lived in many bodies from the late 1700s to the present. At first, the editors thought it was fiction, but it was very well-researched fiction that included accurate historical facts about many different times. The addition of new information about Josephine Caldwell and Oakwood Plantation that had never been published changed their minds. This information could only have come from someone who was there. The manuscript detailed the process of transference with clinical precision. A combination of chemical compounds and meticulous manipulation of the brainstem that purportedly enabled the writer's consciousness to migrate from one body to another, resulting in the gradual fading and ultimate disappearance of the original consciousness. The descriptions of the writer's time as Josephine Caldwell were the most disturbing. One part said, "The plantation years were some of my most peaceful. Hammond was the perfect host. He was rich enough to make me comfortable, alone enough to let me do my experiments, and so in love with me that he didn't notice any mistakes in my performance. If the doctor hadn't become suspicious, I might have stayed at Oakwood for another 10 years before needing to move." The journal called the fire a necessary but regrettable conclusion to the Josephine chapter. It said that when containment fails, elimination becomes necessary. The doctor, the brother, and the girl were all loose ends that could have led to exposure. Fire has always been my preferred method of destruction because it leaves so little evidence and makes it so easy to escape. There was a coded message and a modern address in New Orleans on the last few pages of the manuscript. When investigators tried to find this address, they learned that it belonged to a historical society that had burned down just days before they got there. Before it could be properly verified or published, the original manuscript vanished from the journal's offices. The editor who had been working on it suddenly quit and moved away without giving any information. People have been trying to find her, but they haven't been able to. No one knows the real story of Josephine Caldwell and Oakwood Plantation. Was she just a strange woman whose strange actions led to stories that were too big? Did she make up a new identity to get rich and powerful? Or was she, as some of the more outlandish theories say, something else entirely? A consciousness that had found a way to go beyond the natural limits of life and death, moving from one body to another over the course of centuries? We know for sure that a woman named Josephine Hargrove came to Oakwood Plantation as a bride in 1886. She slept in the same bed as the plantation owner, shared his name, and lived with him for 10 years. And in 1895, Oakwood Plantation burned down, taking all of its secrets with it. At least that's how it looked. People in the county where Oakwood used to be still talk in hushed tones about beautiful strangers with knowing eyes and people who seem strangely familiar even though they've never met them before. They say not to let strangers into your home or tell elegant women who ask too many questions about your family history, too much personal information. Some people say that on certain nights, when the wind blows through the ruins of Oakwood's foundation, they can hear the faint sound of a woman's laughter. It's not the happy laughter of a young bride, but something old and hungry that echoes through time. The disappearances that keep happening in the area may be the most troubling of all. Not often enough to make a pattern, but often enough to keep the story going. A young woman goes missing every 10 years or so, and there is no sign of her. And not long after that, a new person moves into a far-off town. They have a face that no one knows, but they have memories that go back hundreds of years. Is Josephine Caldwell really gone? Or does she still walk among us, wearing a new face and looking for her next body? Is she still alive in a way that goes against what we think we know about life and death? The proof is still not clear, the witnesses are not trustworthy, and the paperwork is not complete. But maybe, dear viewer, the most worrying question is not who Josephine Caldwell was, but where she is now. Have you felt someone behind you while you've been watching this story? A small change in the air? The weight of old eyes watching how you react? Take a look around. Are you really by yourself, or has this story drawn something to you? Something that sees in you the possibility of its next change? Have a good night's sleep. And maybe, just to be safe, lock your bedroom door.